I was hired to clean that hospice. I followed every rule, and I still regret what I did that night. 4 weeks ago, I walked out of Silver Pine Haven Inpatient Hospice for the last time. I didn't make a speech or hug anyone. I turned in my badge, signed a form that said I was leaving voluntarily, and drove home in silence. I'm 46 years old. I've been a hospice and palliative care physician for more than 2 decades. I've pronounced deaths at 3 a.m. without flinching. That night at Silver Pine changed how I look at my job, and it still keeps me awake. I wasn't hired to mop floors or scrub baseboards. I was brought in as interim medical director to clean up operations. That's how administration phrased it. Clean up documentation, clean up night coverage, clean up system issues before a state inspection. Silver Pine was a small inpatient hospice attached to a larger hospital network. It ran on routines, checklists, and tired but professional staff. I accepted the job because this is what I do. I step into places that are slightly off balance and make them functional again. I believe in protocols. I believe in documentation. I believe that if doctors and nurses follow the rules, patients are protected. That belief was intact when I started my first overnight audit shift. Night shifts in hospice are quieter but heavier. Nurses move slower, not because they're lazy, but because everything they do has weight. Comfort meds, repositioning, family members who don't want to leave the bedside. I checked in with the charge nurse, Kira Donnelly, and the nursing supervisor, Tanya Brooks. We reviewed census and symptom control issues. Everything sounded routine. Tired but routine. I walked the unit, glanced at medication storage, skimmed the night logs, and made a short list of minor things to address later. Silver Pine felt exactly like 100 other facilities I'd worked in. Just after 1 a.m, one of the nurses stopped me near the end of the hall. "Can you come look at a room with me?" she asked. "It doesn't feel right." Nurses don't say things like that casually. They're trained to describe problems in measurable terms. When a nurse says something doesn't feel right, it's worth listening. The room had been discharged earlier that evening. It should have been ready for the next admission. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed the temperature. It wasn't freezing, it was just wrong. The air felt colder than it should have been for a climate-controlled hospice room. I looked at the thermostat. 72 degrees. Doctors are trained to trust data. Numbers matter. Screens matter. If something feels off, you look for an explanation that fits the measurements. I walked closer to the bed. The mattress still held a clear impression of where a body had been lying. Hospice mattresses usually rebound quickly. This one hadn't. On the bedside table sat a plastic cup of water, about half full. "Has anyone been back in here?" I asked. The nurse shook her head. "Not since discharge." I told myself the room cooled down when environmental services propped the door open. I told myself memory foam behaves differently at night. I told myself I was overthinking a facilities issue. Still, I asked maintenance to come take a look. I asked the nurse to hold off assigning the room. That wasn't dramatic, it was cautious. While we waited, I stood in the doorway and watched the room. The cup of water was still there. The bed still hadn't reset. The thermostat still read 72. I didn't feel afraid. I felt annoyed. Annoyed that something small was interrupting a routine night. Annoyed that systems we rely on can be imprecise. If you've ever worked in a hospital or hospice, you know irritation is often the first sign that something bigger is surfacing. I stepped back into the hallway. The air there felt normal, predictable. The contrast made the room stand out in a way I couldn't ignore. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a comfort issue, it was a systems issue. If you've worked in healthcare or trusted a hospital with someone you love, leave a comment and tell me whether you've seen moments where the data said one thing and reality said another. And if you want more real doctors and nurses stories like this, subscribe to the channel. When the maintenance supervisor arrived with his thermometer, I watched his face change as he took the first reading. The number didn't match the screen on the wall. He checked again. The room was significantly colder than the system said it was. No alarms had gone off. According to every digital record, nothing was wrong. I wrote the time down. I wrote the temperature down. I took a photo of the thermostat and another of the handheld reading. Not because I was scared, but because that's what you do when something doesn't fit. I asked him to take readings at multiple points in the room, not just near the door. By the bed, near the window, by the vent. Each number landed in the same range, low 50s. He frowned, scrolled through his tablet, and shook his head. The building system still showed normal. No alerts, no variance flags. From a compliance standpoint, everything looked perfect. From where we were standing, it clearly wasn't. I noted the exact locations, the sequence of readings, and who was present. Nurses drifted back to their stations, but no one stopped watching. I stayed in the room. I stepped back into the hallway and closed the room door softly behind me, not because anyone told me to, but because something about leaving it open suddenly felt careless. The hallway temperature felt normal again, which bothered me more than if everything had been cold. Normal made it easier to ignore what I'd just seen. Normal let people move on. I didn't want to move on yet. I walked toward the nurse's station and watched how the unit functioned when nothing appeared wrong. Night shifts in an inpatient hospice don't look dramatic from the outside. No codes, no overhead announcements, just low voices, slow footsteps, and the steady rhythm of nurses checking comfort meds. That's part of what makes problems harder to spot. There's no chaos to blame them on. I leaned against the counter and reviewed the census. 8 patients on the unit, 2 general inpatient level, the rest routine symptom management. No one was crashing, no one was actively dying. This should have been a quiet night. Tanya Brooks was reviewing notes at the computer. She'd been a nurse for more than 15 years and supervised nights because she didn't panic easily. I trusted her instincts. Anything else weird? I asked. She glanced up. Not yet. That word sat between us longer than it needed to. I made my way down the hall, checking rooms without going in. Families sat in chairs, coats draped over their arms, eyes fixed on monitors they didn't fully understand. Hospice teaches you how quickly people learn to read numbers when they're scared. One nurse adjusted a blanket. Another whispered to a patient who couldn't respond. Everything looked exactly the way it should. I circled back toward the room we'd just checked. The maintenance supervisor, Ray Puckett, was still scrolling through system data on his tablet. He'd been doing this long enough to know when numbers didn't behave. "You seeing anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "System thinks it's perfect." He didn't sound confident saying it. I asked him to leave the room untouched for now. No adjustments, no resets. I wanted to see if the readings changed on their own. That's not paranoia, that's basic troubleshooting. I returned to the nurse's station and pulled up the overnight environmental log. Temperatures were recorded once per shift unless there was a complaint. Everything before midnight was within range. No flags, no notes. This was the part of my job I liked least. When systems didn't lie outright, they implied. Silence became proof that nothing was wrong. A nurse approached the desk and quietly asked about room assignments for an incoming transfer. A general inpatient admission was expected before dawn. I hesitated longer than I should have before answering. "Hold for now," I said. "I want to clear a room first." She nodded without asking why. Nurses learn quickly when to trust hesitation. I walked back down the hall and paused outside the room again. The door was still closed. The small sign read, "Cleaned." It shouldn't have. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air hadn't warmed. The bed still hadn't reset. The cup of water was lower than it had been earlier. Not empty, just lower. I stared at it longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Water doesn't disappear on its own in a sealed room. It doesn't drop that fast without a reason. I checked the surface of the table. Dry. No condensation. No spill marks. I lifted the cup and felt how cold it was. I set it back down and took another photo. Back at the station, Kira Donnelly looked up at me. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. That's a reflex in healthcare. We say it when we're anything but. I asked her to keep an ear out for any other complaints about temperature. Not just that it was cold, that it felt wrong. She raised an eyebrow, but agreed. Minutes passed. The unit settled into its usual overnight lull. Phones didn't ring, alarms stayed quiet. The kind of calm administrators love and clinicians distrust. I reviewed medication orders, checked comfort protocols, and signed off on a few routine notes. My mind kept pulling back to the room at the end of the hall. I didn't like that it wasn't announcing itself as a problem. I didn't like that it required attention. A call came in from the other side of the unit. One of the nurses lowered her voice when she spoke. "Can you come down here?" she asked, "just to feel something." That phrasing again. Feel. I walked toward her room and noticed the temperature shift before I crossed the threshold. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, enough that you'd doubt yourself if you weren't paying attention. The thermostat read 72. I didn't say anything right away. I stepped farther into the room, closer to the bed. The patient had been discharged earlier that evening. The mattress held the same shallow indentation I'd seen before. Not as deep, but not gone. The nurse watched me closely. "It's been like that for an hour." I nodded and pulled out my phone again. Same process, same documentation, same quiet irritation. I was no longer thinking about one room. I was thinking about a pattern that didn't have language yet. Ray arrived a few minutes later and took another reading. Same range, same confusion, same clean system logs. We stood there longer than necessary, three professionals in a room that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. No one joked, no one speculated. That silence mattered. I asked Ray to map the airflow zones on the tablet. He pulled them up and traced the boundaries with his finger. The rooms fell into the same zone. Older wing, older controls. Could be nothing, he said. Could be, I replied. I stepped back into the hallway and took a slow breath. The air there still felt fine. That contrast pressed against my ribs in a way I didn't like. I made a decision I hadn't planned to make when my shift started. I told the nurses to stop prepping rooms in that zone until I said otherwise. No rush, no explanations to families yet. Tanya looked at me carefully. "You want to escalate? I want to understand," I said. That answer felt honest. It also felt like the point of no return. I stayed near the nurses' station instead of retreating to my office. I wanted to see the unit respond in real time. I wanted to notice what systems missed. The cup of water was still sitting where I'd left it. I picked up the cup and turned it slightly in my hand, more out of habit than suspicion, then set it back exactly where it had been and stepped away like I didn't want to disturb the room. I don't believe rooms notice things. I believe people do, and I was noticing too much. Ray stood beside me, scrolling through airflow diagrams, while the nurse hovered near the doorway. No one spoke. That silence wasn't fear, it was concentration. When you work in healthcare long enough, you learn the difference. I checked the thermostat again, 72. I tapped the screen once, just to make sure it wasn't frozen. It responded immediately, bright, confident, wrong. "Take another reading by the bed," I said. Ray knelt, held the thermometer low, then higher. The numbers barely moved, low 50s. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. I walked around the bed and pressed my hand flat against the mattress. It was firmer than it should have been, the kind of stiffness you get when material has been cold for hours. Memory foam is honest that way. It reacts to physics, not policy. "How long was the patient here?" I asked. 9 days, the nurse said. 82. Pneumonia complications. Family. Yes, a lot. That tracked. Families don't come and go quietly in hospice. They settle in, they rearrange, they leave marks you don't always see on charts. I stepped back and looked at the room the way surveyors do. Walls, floor, vents, window seals, everything appeared intact. Nothing screamed malfunction. That bothered me more than an obvious failure would have. "Has anyone cleaned since discharge?" I asked. "EVS came through," she said. "Standard terminal clean." I nodded. That meant chemicals strong enough to make your eyes water, and a checklist long enough to miss something subtle. I left the room and walked down the hall to find Miguel Santos, the EVS lead. He'd been here long enough to know the building's moods. "Did anything seem off in that room?" I asked. He thought for a second. Cold, he said. Not broken cold, just cold enough to notice. Did you adjust anything? No. Thermostat said normal. Of course it did. I thanked him and walked back toward the nurse's station. On the way, I passed another room that had been discharged earlier in the evening. I slowed without meaning to and placed my hand near the door frame. The air felt fine, predictable. I stopped there longer than necessary, then moved on. Back at the desk, I pulled up patient placement history. I wanted to see how rooms had been used over the past week. Patterns hide in boring data. That's when I saw it. The first room, then the second one Kira had mentioned earlier. Both had been occupied by members of the same family. Not obvious at first glance. Different last names, different admitting diagnoses. But the emergency contact details matched. I didn't react immediately. Correlation isn't causation, and hospice is full of coincidences. Families get admitted together all the time after a cascade of events. Still, I made a note. I stood up as a nurse approached, her voice low. We've got another one. She didn't say cold. She didn't need to. The room was farther down the wing mirror layout to the first. As soon as I crossed the threshold, my shoulders tightened. Not fear, recognition, same feel, same wrongness. The thermostat glowed 72. The bed held an indentation that shouldn't have been there anymore. On the bedside table sat a cup of water fuller than the first one had been when I started watching it. How long? I asked. About 40 minutes, she said. I thought it was me. I shook my head. It's not. Ray arrived behind me and took another reading. Same result, same expression. He didn't even bother checking the system this time. He already knew what it would say. This doesn't make sense, he said quietly. That's not the problem, I replied. It makes too much sense. He looked at me. Explain. I gestured around the room. Same wing, same zone, same time of night, same behavior. I didn't say family, not yet. I asked the nurse to leave us alone for a moment and close the door. I wanted to feel the space without an audience. I walked the perimeter, checking vents with my hand, then crouched near the baseboard. The cold was stronger near the floor. That mattered. I stood and pressed my palm against the wall beneath the window. Cooler than expected, not frozen, just off. Ray pulled up the zone diagram again. These rooms are on the same night schedule, he said. I nodded. Energy saving mode. Supposed to be minimal, he said. Shouldn't drop like this. Supposed to, I repeated. I looked at the bed again, then at the cup. I took a photo. This time I added a video clip panning from the thermostat to the thermometer reading in Ray's hand. I wasn't documenting for drama. I was documenting because I could already feel how easy this would be to dismiss later. Back at the nurse's station, Tanya waited for me. She'd seen enough to know something had shifted. How bad? She asked. Not dangerous yet, I said carefully, but trending wrong. She exhaled slowly. What do you want to do? I paused. The answer wasn't obvious. Escalating too fast would create panic. Ignoring it would create risk. Stop assigning those rooms, I said. Redirect admissions, quietly. She nodded. No pushback. That was trust. I sat down and pulled up the family charts side by side. Different diagnoses, different ages, same contact numbers, same emergency address. 3 generations. I didn't draw conclusions. I noted facts. I stood again when a nurse returned from the first room, her brow furrowed. The water's gone, I followed her without speaking. The cup was empty, bone dry, no ring on the table, no moisture on the tray, no smell of cleaner. I crouched and checked the floor. Dry, I checked the trash. Nothing. I straightened slowly, not because I was scared, but because I was recalibrating. This wasn't a one-off. It wasn't even 2. It was a system doing something consistently while insisting it wasn't. I checked the time. Still early enough that we could control the night. Still late enough that mistakes would be invisible by morning. I looked at Ray. I need full access to the environmental logs, I said, not summaries. He nodded. I'll pull everything. I looked back at the room one more time. The bed hadn't changed. The air still pressed against my lungs in a way that didn't match the numbers. I made another decision quieter than the last. I stayed on the unit instead of retreating to my office. I wanted to see what happened next without filters. I pulled up a chair near the nurse's station and kept my eyes on the hallway. The thermostat screen stayed bright. The system stayed calm. And the rooms did exactly what they wanted. I stayed seated at the nurse's station longer than I normally would, pretending to review charts while actually watching the hallway out of the corner of my eye. Hospice nights teach you patience. Things rarely announce themselves. They drift into awareness slowly, the way discomfort does when you sit in the wrong position for too long. You don't notice at first, then suddenly it's all you can think about. Ray returned with his laptop open, the glow reflecting off his glasses. He pulled up environmental logs that most clinicians never see. Raw data, timestamps, sensor inputs, system assumptions. According to this, he said, tapping the screen, everything's fine. I didn't respond. We both knew that sentence had lost meaning. I leaned in and scanned the numbers myself. Set points steady, no alerts, no deviation flags. The system believed it was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. What's the sensor reading from? I asked. He hesitated for half a second. Hallway, not the room, not in this wing, he said, older build. That explained more than he realized. So the thermostat in the room, I said, is basically a display. Pretty much. I nodded slowly. That wasn't a failure. That was a design choice, one that made a lot of assumptions about how buildings behave at night. I stood and walked back toward the first room, Ray close behind me. The hallway still felt neutral. The shift in temperature hit as soon as I crossed the threshold. I stopped near the door and looked back at him. Tell me what the system thinks is happening right now. He glanced at the screen. Normal airflow, normal temp. And what's actually happening? He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. I moved closer to the vent and held my hand underneath it. The air coming out wasn't aggressive. It was steady, cold enough that you'd ignore it if you weren't trained to notice small things. How long does the night schedule run? I asked. Until 6, he said, energy saving mode, pulling from outside in part. That settled in my chest uncomfortably. October nights in Spokane aren't mild. Pulling external air without adequate tempering isn't catastrophic in an office building. In hospice, it's different. I stepped back and looked at the bed again. The indentation was still there, less dramatic than earlier but persistent. The mattress hadn't warmed enough to rebound. I pressed down with my hand, then lifted it. The shape stayed. I imagined a cachectic patient lying there for hours, body heat, low circulation, poor. Comfort isn't optional in hospice, it's the job. I walked to the bedside table and touched the cup again. Cold. I tilted it slightly. Nothing spilled. I turned it over. No cracks visible. That didn't mean there weren't microfractures. I set it back down and made another note. Back at the station, Kira was documenting a routine medication administration. She looked up when she saw my face. You find anything? She asked. I found enough to be careful, I said. That was the truth. I wasn't ready to call it a failure yet, but I was past calling it coincidence. I pulled up the admissions list again and looked at the family names. 3 patients, 3 rooms, same wing, same night schedule, same timing. Who was here first? I asked. Kira scrolled. The husband, stroke, transferred in from the hospital, and the other's wife came a few days later. Then her mother, 3 generations, different diagnoses, same building. I didn't say what I was thinking. I didn't need to. Hospice clinicians know how quickly family systems collapse under stress. They also know how hard families try to stay together even when logistics pull them apart. I walked back down the hall and stopped outside the 3rd room. The nurse on duty watched me carefully. You feel it too, she said. Yes, I replied, and that matters. Doctors aren't supposed to say things like that. We're trained to quantify, not validate sensations, but nurses live in the space between numbers and bodies. Ignoring that is how you miss things. I stepped inside, same pattern, same temperature shift, same quiet insistence that something was off. Ray took another reading and sighed under his breath. It's consistent, he said. Consistency is a system, I replied. We stood there longer than was efficient. Efficiency had stopped being the goal. I asked Ray to pull airflow data hour by hour for the entire wing, not summaries, actual curves. I wanted to see when the drop started. He complied without argument. He knew I wasn't fishing. Back at the station, Tanya joined us. She'd finished a call with a family member and looked tired in the way only hospice supervisors do. "You're shutting rooms," she said. "Yes, administration won't like that." "I know." She studied my face. "Is it unsafe?" I considered the question carefully. Unsafe is a loaded word in hospice. Comfort failures can be just as harmful as clinical ones. "It could be," I said, "and it's undocumented." She nodded once. That was all. Ray pointed to the screen. "Temperature drops start around midnight," he said. "Bottom out between 1 and 4. Every night I asked. "Looks like it," he said, "and no one noticed." He shrugged. "If no one complains, the system doesn't care." That sentence stayed with me. I thought about how many patients had slept through nights like this, how many families had assumed discomfort was part of dying, how many nurses had adjusted blankets without realizing the room itself was working against them. I felt a flicker of anger then, not panic. Anger. I documented everything again. Timestamps, locations, names, measurements. I knew exactly how this would play out if I didn't. By morning, the system would reset, the numbers would normalize, the rooms would warm, and without documentation, this would vanish. I checked the time, still before 3. I made another choice. I asked Tanya to notify administration that I was escalating an environmental concern. No speculation, no conclusions, just facts. She hesitated. "Tonight, yes." She nodded and made the call. I stayed on the unit. I didn't go back to my office. I wanted to be present when the system shifted again. Ray packed up his handheld devices but left the logs open. "Call me if anything changes," he said. "I will," I replied. I watched the hallway clock tick forward. The room stayed cold. The screen stayed confident. And the gap between them stayed wide enough to notice. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or history or meaning. I was thinking about a system that had learned how to look normal while doing something quietly wrong. And I was still sitting there when the next nurse came down the hall, her expression tight, already shaking her head before she spoke. I stood up as soon as I saw her because by then my body was reacting faster than my brain. She didn't raise her voice or rush. She didn't need to. She just said my name quietly the way nurses do when something crosses the line from annoying to concerning. "It's happening again," she said. I followed her without asking where. We both knew. The third room sat at the far end of the wing, same layout as the others. Same muted lighting, same faint smell of disinfectant that never quite leaves hospice spaces. I felt the temperature shift before the door fully closed behind us. That familiar, subtle resistance in the air, like stepping into a walk-in fridge that isn't trying to be cold but hasn't warmed up either. The thermostat read 72. I didn't bother touching it this time. The bed held a shallow but distinct indentation angled slightly toward the window. It looked less like someone had just gotten up and more like someone had been there long enough for the mattress to give up trying to bounce back. "How long has this room been empty?" I asked. "Since yesterday afternoon," the nurse said. "No one's been in here." I nodded and walked to the bedside table. Another cup of water, different cup, same style. Hospital issue, about 3/4 full. I checked the time on my phone and took a photo, not because I expected it to change immediately, but because I needed a reference point. Ray arrived a few minutes later, his expression already resigned. He took the reading without commentary. "Same," he said. I exhaled through my nose and glanced down the hall. 3 rooms, same zone, same hours, same behavior. That wasn't coincidence. That was design intersecting with neglect. I stepped back into the hallway and pulled up the patient records again. This time I didn't just scan names. I mapped timelines, admission dates, discharge times, room assignments. The pattern sharpened. The first patient had arrived 9 days earlier, transferred from the hospital after a stroke. His wife followed a few days later with pneumonia complications. Her mother came in after a fall that left her too unstable to manage at home. 3 separate diagnoses, 3 separate admissions, all within the same week, all placed in the same wing due to bed availability and acuity. I didn't feel anything mystical about it. I felt annoyed at the randomness of logistics, pretending to be neutral. Families like that don't leave quietly. They sit, they watch, they adjust the environment to make it feel human. They pull chairs closer. They close doors that should stay open. They stay past visiting hours because hospice is the one place where no one wants to be told to leave. That mattered. I looked up as Kira joined me. "Administration's asking questions," she said. I expected that. They want to know if this affects patient safety. I thought about the patients who could have been in those beds. Cachectic, hypotensive, already struggling to regulate body temperature. I thought about fentanyl patches, absorption rates shivering, mistaken for terminal agitation. I thought about nurses layering blankets without realizing the room itself was the problem. "Yes," I said, "it does." That was the first time I said it out loud. We walked back into the third room together. Kira stood near the door, arms crossed, scanning the space the way experienced nurses do when they're assessing more than vitals. "This feels wrong," she said. "It is," I replied, "but not for the reason people like." She frowned, meaning, "It's a systems issue," I said, "and systems don't scream." Ray cleared his throat. I pulled more data. We stepped back into the hallway and he showed me the airflow curves. Night schedule engaged just after midnight. External air intake increased. Dampers adjusted based on assumptions made years ago when the building was renovated. What assumptions, I asked? That rooms would be empty overnight, he said, or occupied by people who wouldn't notice. That landed harder than he probably intended. Hospice patients notice everything. They just don't always have the strength to complain. I looked back at the rooms, at the subtle sameness of them, at how easy it would be to miss this if no one was paying attention. "How many nights has this been happening?" I asked. Ray shrugged. "Could be years." That made my stomach tighten. I returned to the nurse's station and opened a fresh note, not a progress note, an incident report. Environmental concern affecting patient comfort, potential safety implications, pattern observed across multiple rooms. I chose my words carefully. Facts only, measurements, timelines, no speculation. Tanya appeared beside me. "Deborah wants an update," she said, referring to the administrator. "She'll get one," I replied. "In writing." Tanya studied my face. "You're serious? I'm doing my job." She nodded slowly. "That's what worries them." A nurse approached us, glancing back toward the rooms. The water levels dropping. I stood and followed her again. The cup I'd photographed earlier was lower. Not empty, just noticeably lower. The timestamp on my phone confirmed it hadn't been touched. I crouched and ran my fingers along the underside of the cup. Slight dampness, barely perceptible. "Enough. Get me a paper towel," I said. She did. I set the cup on it and waited. Within minutes, a faint ring appeared. "There," I said quietly, "microfracture, cold stress." Plastic behaving like plastic. Nothing supernatural, just physics poorly accounted for. I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief that this had an explanation. Frustration that the explanation was so preventable. I documented that too. Back at the station, I sent the incident report. I attached photos, logs, temperature readings. I CC'd facilities and administration. The reply came faster than I expected. "Let's discuss in the morning." I stared at the screen and then locked my phone. Morning would make this look smaller than it was. I looked at the clock. Still before 4. Plenty of night left. I made another decision. I instructed the nurses to cluster care in unaffected rooms. I asked EVS to avoid those rooms entirely until further notice. Quiet containment, no alarms, no announcements. The unit adjusted seamlessly. That's what professionals do. I walked the hallway again, feeling the contrast between rooms that behaved and rooms that didn't. The difference was subtle but undeniable. I thought about how easily this could have been missed. How many systems rely on complaints to function? How hospice patients don't always complain. I thought about the family whose names kept appearing on my screen. 3 generations scattered by logistics, held together by presence. I wasn't thinking about meaning or symbolism. I was thinking about accountability. The hallway clock ticked past 4. The temperature curve stayed flat. The room stayed cold, and the system stayed convinced that everything was exactly as it should be. I sat back down at the nurse's station and pulled the family charts up again, this time side by side, filling the screen until there was no room left to ignore the overlap. Walter Kim, Irene Kim, June Park, 3 patients, 3 admissions, 3 rooms in the same wing. Different diagnoses, different care plans, but the same emergency contacts, the same home address, the same quiet notes from intake nurses trying to capture family dynamics in neutral language. I didn't feel a chill when I saw it. I felt something closer to irritation. Patterns like this don't announce themselves with drama. They sit in plain sight, waiting for someone to slow down enough to notice. Walter Kim had come first. Ischemic stroke, significant deficits, not a candidate for aggressive rehab. Hospice referral from the hospital after his condition plateaued. He'd been placed in the inpatient unit because his wife couldn't manage transfers safely at home. Irene Kim arrived 4 days later. Pneumonia on top of chronic lung disease. Oxygen dependent, medically stable but exhausted in a way charts don't capture well. The intake note mentioned she was reluctant to be separated from spouse. June Park came last, Irene's mother. A fall at home. No fracture but worsening confusion and poor oral intake. Unsafe discharge. Hospice accepted her for symptom management and caregiver support. This wasn't unusual, it was painfully common. Hospice families rarely arrive one at a time. They arrive in clusters pulled in by the same gravity. One illness exposes the fault lines holding everything together. The 3 of them had been placed in separate rooms because they had to be. Different levels of care, different equipment needs, different availability on a unit that was almost always full. No conspiracy, no intention. Still, I could see the notes between the lines. Irene asking staff to let her know when Walter slept. June refusing pain medication until she knew her daughter was okay. A nurse documenting that Irene remained at bedside longer than typical visiting hours. Hospice doesn't enforce visiting hours the way hospitals do. We pretend we do, but we don't. We understand Vigil. We understand that leaving can feel like abandonment when time is running out. I closed the charts and leaned back, staring at the ceiling tiles above the station. They were stained from a leak that had been underscore toggle patched years earlier. No one ever notices those things until they're already broken. Kira sat across from me, flipping through MERs. "You're thinking about the family," she said. "Yes, they were always together," she said. Even when they weren't supposed to be. That made sense. Families don't follow room assignments. They follow each other. I pictured Irene pulling a chair closer to Walter's bed, then dragging it down the hall later when she was too tired to walk back to her own room. I pictured June sitting wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, waiting in silence because she didn't want to bother anyone. None of that was documented as a problem. None of it ever is. I stood and walked down the hall again, stopping outside the rooms without going in. From the outside, they looked identical to every other room on the unit. Closed doors, soft lighting, the illusion of control. I didn't believe the family had caused the temperature drop directly. I believed they'd interacted with the space in ways the system hadn't been designed to accommodate. Chairs moved, doors closed, curtains drawn. Airflow altered subtly but consistently. Hospice spaces are designed around assumptions that patients are still, that families rotate out, that rooms reset themselves when someone leaves. Those assumptions break down in real life. Ray joined me in the hallway, rubbing his temples. "I ran the airflow simulations again," he said. When doors stay closed for long periods, overnight pressure changes. Enough to matter, I asked. Combined with the damper issue, he said yes. I nodded. That aligned with what we were seeing. Not a single failure, a series of small ones stacking quietly. I stepped into the first room again. The bed was still marked, the air still wrong, the cup still sitting where I'd left it, now resting on the damp paper towel. This room hadn't psychologically reset yet. Not because of anything mystical, because real people had occupied it deeply and the system hadn't caught up. I checked the clock. The night was sliding forward minute by minute toward morning, toward normalization, toward plausible deniability. Tanya approached me, lowering her voice. Deborah wants reassurance about what I asked, that this isn't something else. I met her eyes. It's exactly what it looks like. She frowned. And that is a building that wasn't designed for the way hospice actually works, I said, and a system that hasn't been forced to notice. She exhaled slowly. They won't like that explanation. I know. We stood there for a moment, watching a nurse adjust a blanket in a room farther down the hall. The movement was gentle, practiced, almost automatic. Hospice work is full of movements like that. Small acts repeated so often they become invisible. Systems love invisibility. I walked back to the station and opened the incident report again, rereading what I'd written. It was factual, clean, hard to argue with. I added one line. Family presence and room usage patterns may have contributed to airflow changes, not blame. Context. Kira looked at me. That's going to make people uncomfortable. It should, I said. She nodded once. Another nurse passed by and paused. It's warmer near the desk, she said almost conversationally. I know, I replied. The contrast mattered. It meant the problem wasn't universal. It was targeted, specific, predictable. I pulled up the environmental curves again and watched them in real time. Still low, still flat. I imagined what morning rounds would look like. Warm rooms, normal readings, blank stares. I imagined explaining this to someone who only trusted summaries. I thought about the family again. 3 people navigating the end of multiple lives at once, doing what families do in hospice. Staying, watching, adjusting the space to feel less like an institution. They hadn't done anything wrong. The system had simply never been asked to account for them. I stood up and walked back toward the rooms one more time, stopping halfway down the hall. The air changed right at the boundary. I could feel it every time. I stayed there right on the edge where the system's assumptions met reality and waited to see which one would give first. I didn't move when the nurse walked past me because I wanted to feel exactly where the temperature shifted without breaking the moment. She slowed, glanced at me, then followed my gaze down the hall. Right there, she said. That's where it changes. I know, I replied. We stood side by side for a few seconds. 2 clinicians doing what we're trained to do when something doesn't line up, observe without overreacting. No alarms, no raised voices, just attention. Vigil changes how people behave in a space. Hospice nurses understand this instinctively. Families don't just visit, they occupy. They claim territory the way humans always have when time is limited. Chairs get pulled closer, doors get closed to create privacy. Curtains stay drawn long after daylight would normally come in. None of that shows up in a system log. I walked back to the nurses' station and watched the unit through that lens. The night wasn't chaotic, it was dense. Emotional weight hung in the air even where the temperature didn't drop. A nurse documented medication administration, her posture slightly forward like she was holding something together with muscle memory alone. Another refilled water cups, pausing before stepping into one of the affected rooms. Do you want me to go in there? She asked. Not right now, I said. She nodded and moved on. That hesitation mattered. Nurses don't hesitate unless their instincts are already engaged. I pulled up staffing notes from earlier in the week. Nothing alarming, just comments about families staying late, asking questions, requesting extra blankets, normal hospice things. But normal accumulates. I thought about Irene Kim again. about how she'd refused discharge until she knew her husband was settled, about how she'd likely spent hours moving back and forth between rooms, too tired to register how cold it felt as long as she could sit near him. Hospice doesn't track how long someone sits in a chair. It tracks medications, pain scores, vital signs. The rest lives in the margins. I walked down the hall and stopped outside Walter Kim's old room. The door was closed now. EVS had done their job. The bed was made, the surface wiped, the checklist completed, but the room still felt heavy. Not haunted. Used in a way systems don't reset for. I opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind me. The air pressed against my chest the same way it had all night. The bed was still cool to the touch. The mattress hadn't fully rebounded. I pulled a chair closer and sat down just to see what it felt like to occupy the space instead of assess it. The chair scraped softly across the floor. The sound felt too loud. Sitting there, I understood something I hadn't articulated before. Hospice rooms don't empty when patients leave. They decompress slowly like lungs. Families exhale into them. Nurses absorb what's left. Systems assume equilibrium will return on schedule. Sometimes it doesn't. I stood up and checked the vent again. Air flowed steadily, indifferent to context. The system wasn't malicious. It was literal. I left the room and found Kira leaning against the counter, rubbing her wrist. "This place is heavy tonight," she said. "It usually is," I replied. "No," she said. "This is different." I didn't argue. I didn't need to. We've all worked shifts that felt longer than they were, where you leave more tired than your body should allow, where the emotional labor stacks up quietly until you feel compressed. This was that kind of night. I glanced at the clock. After 3:30, still enough night left for this to matter. Tanya joined us, her phone tucked into her pocket. "Administration wants reassurance that patients aren't at risk," she said. I chose my words carefully. "Patients aren't in immediate danger," I said, "but comfort is being compromised." "That's harder to defend," she said. "I know. Comfort is subjective until it isn't, until it affects sleep, until it alters medication needs, until nurses start compensating in ways that don't get documented." I watched a nurse bring in extra blankets for a patient in an unaffected room. The muscle memory was automatic. Warmth solves a lot of problems temporarily. Temporarily is the problem. I stepped away from the desk and walked toward the affected zone again. The temperature change met me halfway down the hall. Predictable now, familiar. I stopped where it shifted and closed my eyes for a moment. I wasn't praying. I was calibrating. Doctors aren't taught to do this. We're taught to intervene, to correct, to escalate. But hospice work teaches you when to pause and let the environment tell you what it's doing. The environment was saying the same thing over and over again. It wasn't designed for this level of presence. I opened my eyes and noticed something I hadn't earlier. The door seals on these rooms were tighter than the others. A renovation detail meant to improve privacy and sound control. Doors stayed closed more effectively. Air stayed trapped longer. Small design choice, big consequence. I made a note. Back at the station, Ray texted me an update. More confirmation of what we already knew. No new alerts. No system acknowledgement. I typed a reply asking him to preserve the raw data. I didn't want it normalized. A nurse approached me quietly. "The family from earlier called," she said. "They wanted to thank us." "For what?" "For letting them stay as long as they did." I nodded, unsure what to say. Gratitude in hospice often arrives late after the cost has already been paid. I watched the unit continue its slow rhythm. Meds given, comfort checks, charting completed. The work didn't stop just because the system was wrong. That's what made this dangerous. Hospice nurses compensate. They always do. They add blankets. They adjust schedules. They absorb discomfort into their own bodies because patients can't. Systems rely on that. I walked back toward the affected rooms again, not because I expected them to change, but because I wanted to remain present with the problem instead of filing it away. The temperature hadn't shifted. The air was still wrong. The bed still held its shape. I leaned against the wall and felt the cool seep through my coat. Not unbearable, just persistent. I thought about how many nights like this had passed unnoticed, how many patients had slept lightly without knowing why, how many nurses had shrugged and adapted. This wasn't about ghosts or history or meaning. It was about the quiet accumulation of small failures that no one feels responsible for because they don't announce themselves. I straightened and checked the time again. The night was thinning. Morning would arrive soon enough. I stayed where I was, listening to the unit breathe, watching how people moved around the spaces that refused to let go of what had happened inside them. The light in the hallway shifted before anyone commented on the time, a dull gray creeping in through the narrow windows at the end of the wing. Morning doesn't arrive in hospice all at once. It leaks in slowly, the way awareness does after a long night. Nurses don't suddenly feel rested. Doctors don't suddenly feel certain. The building just starts behaving the way it's expected to. I checked the thermostat in the nearest room out of habit. 72. The air felt different now. Not warm, just neutral. The kind of neutral that invites forgetting. I stepped farther inside. The mattress had begun to rebound. Not fully, but enough that someone could convince themselves it always looked that way. The indentation was softer, less defined, like a memory losing sharp edges. I didn't feel relieved. I felt uneasy. Ray arrived again just after 5, carrying the same equipment he'd been using all night. He didn't say anything when he took the first reading. He just showed me the screen. 68, rising. He took another reading near the bed, similar, near the window, slightly cooler but within range. The system's right now, he said. I nodded. I know. That was the problem. We walked through each of the affected rooms together. In every one, the same thing was happening. Temperature climbing, air settling, beds recovering, cups dry. The paper towel beneath the cup in the third room was still faintly damp, the ring barely visible now. By the time EVS came through again, it would disappear entirely. Nothing had been fixed yet. Nothing had been repaired. The system had simply switched modes. At the nurse's station, Tanya was finishing a report for day shift. She glanced up when she saw us. "It feels normal again," she said. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated. "That's good, right?" I didn't answer immediately. Good depends on whether you care more about outcomes or explanations. Day shift nurses began arriving, coffee in hand, voices louder than the night staff's had been. The unit felt different, with more bodies moving through it, more noise, less space for subtlety. I gave a brief verbal handoff to the incoming supervisor. I stuck to facts. Environmental fluctuation overnight. Rooms held temporarily. No patient harm identified. Documentation completed. He nodded, already thinking about staffing and breakfast trays. I didn't blame him. Day shift has its own pressures. I walked back to the rooms one last time while they were still empty. In daylight, they looked exactly like what they were supposed to be. Clean, calm, ready. I stood in the doorway of the first room and tried to imagine how this would sound in a meeting. The rooms were cold, but only at night. The system didn't register it. It resolved by morning. None of that sounds urgent when said out loud. I returned to my office and sat down for the first time all night. My body noticed the chair immediately. The fatigue settled in, heavy and unavoidable. I opened the incident report again and reread it line by line. It was accurate, it was dry, it was easy to skim past. I added one more attachment: Ray's raw data files, not summaries. The unfiltered numbers. I hit send. A reply from administration came in within minutes. "Thanks for the update. We'll review." Review is a flexible word. It can mean investigate, it can mean acknowledge. It can also mean wait for the problem to stop announcing itself. I closed my laptop and walked back onto the unit. EVS was already prepping carts. Fresh linens, disinfectant bottles, the usual reset that makes nights like this disappear. Miguel looked up when he saw me. "Everything okay?" "For now," I said. He nodded and went back to work. I watched him strip a bed in one of the rooms that had been cold all night. The mattress looked ordinary now, cooperative. the kind of ordinary that invites trust. I felt a brief, irrational urge to tell him to stop, to leave it as it was, to preserve evidence. Instead, I said nothing. That's how systems win. They normalize faster than people can object. A nurse passed by me, glancing into one of the rooms. "Feels better," she said. "Yes," I replied again. I checked the time. Almost 6. The night staff began signing out one by one. They moved more slowly than usual, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes tired. None of them said anything dramatic. They didn't need to. Shared experience doesn't require commentary. Kira paused before leaving. "You staying for a bit," I said. She nodded. "It was a weird night." "Yes." She left without waiting for reassurance. I walked back down the hall, stopping at the same invisible boundary where the temperature had shifted earlier. I crossed it again. Nothing. I stepped back. Still nothing. The line had vanished. I stood there longer than necessary, testing a reality that had already moved on. The building didn't acknowledge me. It had reset. I went back to my office and started drafting a follow-up email. Careful wording, neutral tone, no accusations, no implications. I deleted the first version and started over. Words matter in institutions. The wrong one can bury a problem permanently. I chose phrases like observed discrepancy, overnight, variance, potential, comfort, implications. Safe words, words that pass review committees. I sent it and closed my email. Breakfast trays began rolling down the hall. The smell of coffee replaced disinfectant. The unit transitioned smoothly into day mode. From the outside, nothing about this morning suggested anything had been wrong. That was the part that bothered me most. I stood near the nurses' station as the first family members arrived, coats on, voices hushed. They stepped into rooms that felt comfortable, predictable, safe. They had no idea what those spaces had done hours earlier. I checked the thermostat one last time. 72. I rested my hand on the wall and felt nothing unusual. The surface was cool but appropriate, acceptable. I reminded myself that systems aren't designed to explain themselves. They're designed to function within tolerances. Overnight discomfort had fallen outside those tolerances only temporarily. Now it didn't exist. I gathered my notes and slipped them into my bag instead of leaving them on my desk. Not because I planned to hide them, but because I didn't trust the building to remember. As I walked toward the exit, I passed the rooms again, now fully awake. Sunlight caught the edges of the beds. Everything looked clean. I paused once more, hand on a doorframe, waiting for some trace of the night to push back. Nothing did. The hospice had returned to baseline and the system was satisfied. I wasn't. I didn't go home after that shift. I stayed long enough for the building to convince itself that nothing unusual had happened, then stayed a little longer so I could watch how the explanation formed. By mid-morning, the language had already started to change. What had been an overnight environmental discrepancy became a minor temperature fluctuation. The phrase appeared in an email from facilities before anyone had asked me how the rooms had actually felt. Not measured, felt. I sat in my office with the door closed and read the message twice. It was professionally written, calm, reassuring, the kind of wording designed to prevent follow-up questions. I replied with a request for a meeting, in person, same day. They agreed faster than I expected. The conference room was too bright for how little sleep I'd had. Deborah Klein, the regional hospice administrator, sat at the head of the table with a tablet in front of her. Ray joined by speakerphone. A facilities consultant I didn't recognize sat quietly near the end. No nurses were invited. Deborah smiled in the way administrators do when they want cooperation without confrontation. "We reviewed the data," she said. "It appears the overnight HVAC schedule caused a temporary variance." I nodded. "That's not new information." "The issue corrected itself by morning," she continued. "No patients were harmed." "That depends on how you define harm," I said. The smile tightened. Comfort was maintained. I leaned forward. Comfort was compensated for. Silence settled over the table. Not tension, calculation. Ray cleared his throat over the speaker. The sensor placement is part of the issue, he said. The system reads hallway temperature, not room temperature. Deborah turned slightly. And that's within code. Yes, he said. It passed inspection. That doesn't mean it works for hospice, I said. She met my eyes. It meets regulatory requirements. That was the line, the one everything pivoted around. I pulled up my documentation and slid my tablet across the table. Photos, timestamps, temperature readings. The water ring captured mid-evaporation. The consultant leaned in interest, flickering briefly before professional caution returned. This looks like a design limitation, Deborah said after a moment. Not a failure, a limitation that affects patient comfort at night, I replied, repeatedly. But transiently, she said, and without long-term impact. I took a breath. We don't measure long-term impact in hospice. We measure comfort in moments. She didn't disagree. She redirected. We can adjust wording, she said. Frame it as an optimization opportunity. There it was. Not fix, frame. I sat back and studied the room. Everyone there was competent. No one was lying outright. They were doing what institutions do when faced with inconvenient truths, reducing them to language that fits existing categories. Are you asking me to change my report? I asked. Clarify it, she said. Remove speculative elements. I didn't speculate. You referenced family presence, she said. That introduces variables we can't control. Families are the core variable in hospice, I replied. We don't control them because we shouldn't. Her jaw tightened. This is about scope. No, I said. It's about honesty. The consultant finally spoke. If this goes into the record as a system deficiency, it triggers a cascade. Oversight, follow-ups, potential citations, I'm aware, I said. And if it's documented as a resolved overnight fluctuation, Deborah added, it closes. I understood exactly what they were offering. Plausible resolution, clean closure, everyone moves on. I also understood what it would cost. Hospice medicine teaches you to tolerate ambiguity. It doesn't teach you to tolerate erasure. I won't change the report, I said. Deborah studied me for a long moment. Then we'll need to add an addendum. By whom? Facilities, she said. Clarifying technical context, diluting clinical reality, I replied. She sighed, the sound of someone who'd had this conversation before. Dr. Langston, this isn't a hill worth standing on. I thought about the nurses who'd added blankets without knowing why, the patients who'd slept lightly, the family who'd stayed late because they sensed something fragile. It is to me, I said. The meeting ended politely, too politely. Back on the unit, the day moved on. Admissions resumed. The affected rooms were filled again. New patients, new families, new assumptions. I checked one of the rooms in the afternoon. Comfortable, as designed. That was the danger. Systems that fail intermittently teach people to distrust their own experience. Nurses stop reporting because it doesn't persist. Doctors stop escalating because it resolves. I sat at the nurses' station and watched charting happen. Everything neat, everything compliant. Tanya sat beside me. They talk to you. Yes. And they'd prefer this be smaller than it is. She nodded slowly. Of course they would. She lowered her voice. Are you okay? I considered the question. Physically, yes. Professionally uncertain. I'm deciding, I said. She didn't press. Later that afternoon, an updated report appeared in my inbox. An addendum. Technical language. Passive voice. No mention of patient experience. No mention of nurses' observations. I read it once. Then again. It wasn't false, it was incomplete. That's what made it effective. I walked down the hall and stood outside one of the rooms again. A patient slept peacefully inside. Family members whispered near the window. The room felt fine. That didn't undo what I knew. I thought about how often this happens in medicine. Not dramatic cover-ups. Quiet edits, language that shifts responsibility without denying facts. I opened my laptop and drafted a response. Professional, direct, declining to co-sign the addendum. I didn't send it right away. I sat there hands resting on the keyboard, feeling the familiar weight of a decision that wouldn't announce itself as significant until later. The system had returned to normal. The building was satisfied. Administration was satisfied. Only the documentation was still contested. I closed the laptop and walked back toward my office, passing nurses who were already adapting, already compensating, already moving forward. The problem wasn't that the system had failed. The problem was that it had learned how to fail quietly. And I was standing inside it, deciding how much of that quiet I was willing to accept. I signed the addendum refusal the next morning, not dramatically, not angrily, just as another line item in a system that prefers frictionless compliance. No one reacted right away. That's how these things usually go. Institutions rarely push back in the moment. They wait. They let time do the work for them. I continued my shifts. I rounded. I answered questions. I reviewed charts. From the outside, nothing about my work changed. Inside, something had shifted that didn't reset with the building. The rooms behaved now. Night schedules were adjusted slightly, dampers were recalibrated, facilities sent out a quiet notice about optimization updates, no mention of comfort, no mention of nursing observations. The system corrected itself just enough to avoid scrutiny. I noticed the nurses noticed. They stopped calling those rooms weird. They stopped mentioning temperature unless it was extreme. Not because the issue was gone, but because they'd learned what language survived handoff and what didn't. Hospice clinicians adapt quickly. That's not always a strength. A week later, I sat with a patient whose pain was controlled but whose sleep wasn't. She kept waking up restless, uncomfortable, without being able to explain why. The room felt fine. The numbers were fine. I adjusted medications anyway. That bothered me more than if the room had been cold. We compensate when systems fall short. That's the unspoken agreement in healthcare. Clinicians absorb what infrastructure misses. Nurses absorb what policy ignores. Doctors absorb what documentation can't capture cleanly. It works until it doesn't. I began noticing my own behavior change. I checked thermostats more often than necessary. I lingered in doorways longer than my schedule allowed. I trusted my senses less when they conflicted with screens. That's not sustainable. One afternoon, Deborah asked if I'd reconsidered my stance on the addendum. She framed it as concern for alignment, not compliance. I haven't, I said. She nodded slowly. That may limit your role here. I understand. We both knew what that meant. Interim roles exist to smooth things over, not complicate them. I was doing the opposite. I went back to my office and closed the door. I looked around at the familiar mess of papers, reference books, and half-finished notes. This space had been temporary from the start. I'd known that when I accepted the job. What I hadn't known was how clearly I'd see the boundary between what hospice medicine claims to value and what it actually protects. I drafted my resignation letter that evening. It was brief, professional, vague in the way these letters always are. Personal reasons, career transition, grateful for the opportunity. All true, none complete. I didn't submit it right away. I sat with it overnight the way I'd sat with the rooms, letting it exist without forcing resolution. The next morning, I walked the unit one last time before sending it. The affected rooms were occupied again. Patients rested, families whispered, nurses moved efficiently, quietly, carrying more than their job description suggested. I stopped near the nurses' station where Kira was charting. You leaving? She asked without looking up. Yes, she nodded. That tracks. I'm sorry, I said. She finally looked at me. Don't be. You saw it. That was all. I sent the letter. The response came quickly. Polite, regretful, non-specific, and offered to discuss alternative arrangements. I declined. On my final day, I returned my badge and keys. No ceremony, no announcement. Hospice doesn't do farewells well. People leave all the time quietly. I walked out through the same entrance I'd used every day for weeks. The building looked the same as it always had. Solid, calm, reassuring. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. I work somewhere else now, not hospice, not inpatient, a place where systems behave predictably and deviations announce themselves loudly enough to be addressed without negotiation. The work is easier, cleaner, less morally complex. I sleep better most nights. But sometimes, usually in the early hours, when my brain insists on revisiting unresolved things, I think about those rooms, about how quickly they normalized, about how easily the evidence softened. I think about how much of healthcare depends on the willingness of clinicians to accept explanations that don't quite fit because challenging them costs too much. I didn't leave because the building malfunctioned. I left because I couldn't keep working in a system that required me to doubt my own experience in favor of language designed to smooth over discomfort. Hospice medicine asks clinicians to sit with reality as it is not as we wish it to be. That night, the system failed that standard. It didn't fail loudly. It failed politely, efficiently, in a way that invited everyone involved to move on. I chose not to. I don't tell this story often, not because it's shocking, but because it's familiar to anyone who's spent enough time inside healthcare institutions. The details change, the pattern doesn't. Rooms return to baseline, reports get edited, nurses adapt, doctors rationalize, systems protect themselves, and people who notice too clearly eventually step aside. I didn't leave hospice because I stopped believing in the work. I left because I believed in it too much to accept a version that prioritized smooth operations over honest discomfort. Some failures announce themselves with alarms. Others disappear by morning. The second kind is harder to live with. I still remember how those rooms felt before the system corrected itself. Not cold enough to panic, just wrong enough to notice. That's the space where I learned something I hadn't expected to learn so late in my career. Healthcare systems don't measure everything that matters. They measure what they're built to see. The rest is carried by people. I carried it for as long as I could. Then I put it down and walked away, knowing exactly why I was doing it, even if the official record never would. I've had time to think about that night since I left. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet moments when you realize how much of your career is built on trust. Trust in systems. Trust in screens. Trust that if something is wrong inside a hospital, it will announce itself clearly enough for doctors and nurses to fix it. That night taught me that some problems don't announce themselves. They sit just below the threshold of alarms, relying on clinicians to compensate instead of confront. And over time, that kind of quiet failure becomes normal. The lesson wasn't about HVAC systems or documentation. It was about paying attention when your experience doesn't match what you're being told is fine. In real doctors and nurses' stories, that gap is where moral injury starts. Not with big scandals, but with small moments you're asked to ignore. If you work in healthcare, or if you've trusted a hospital with someone you love, you already understand this more than you might realize. If you want more real-life hospital stories, honest doctors and nurses' stories about what actually happens behind closed doors, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to help you see the system clearly the way the people inside it do. Thanks for listening.